Hello, and thanks again for checking out Loud. This time we're doing a walkthrough of the first letter of John. We're gonna in this session we're gonna finish up the fourth of 5 chapters. So we'll be looking at it's really the second half of verse 16 on through the end of the chapter, which is verse 21. And so there we read. God is love, and those who remain in love remain in God, and God remains in them. This is how love has been perfected in us, so that we can have confidence on the judgment day, because we are exactly the same as God is in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. We love because God first loved us. If anyone says, I love God and hates a brother or sister, he is a liar. Because the person who doesn't love a brother or sister who can be seen can't love God who can't be seen. This commandment we have from him. Those who claim to love God ought to love their brother and sister also. So, of course, the passage starts out and reiterates that powerful and very direct, unambiguous statement that simply says God is love. And so we've covered that ground pretty thoroughly, both building up to it and then in the last session. What caught my eye was there in verse 18, where the author says, there is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear. Because fear expects punishment. The person who is afraid has not been made perfect in love. So, a mentor of mine and a friend recently passed away about 2 years ago. A man named Greg Hall, who was really the one who first invited me to consider a call into ministry. I remember one time we were driving somewhere and he was talking about he'd come to an idea that sin was rooted in fear, that was one of the core, I think he would have been less ambiguous than that, but that was one of the core causes of destructive, sinful behavior was fear. And it may not work in every case, but there is a lot of truth to that understanding, in that when we fear, and we seek to protect ourselves, then we make decisions that don't consider the impact that our decisions are having on the whole. So we're more apt to do harm, intentionally or unintentionally, which I don't think is a factor in whether something would be called sin. Sin isn't just things you intentionally do wrong. Sin, as I've defined it before, I say are things that do harm. And so when we start to fear for ourselves or for the people around us, then we start looking for ways to protect us against each other. And of course, the idea of being perfected in love is not protecting yourself against others, but seeking ways to break down boundaries between others. That doesn't mean we're not smart about protecting ourselves, but it means that we don't make irrational decisions about protecting ourselves. That goes for people, for family, for communities, and certainly for nations. A nation that is absorbed in fear gets caught up. An excellent example from our own nation's history was the internment of Japanese Americans because of the fear that was spreading after Pearl Harbor. So fear is a powerful thing. Now, in this particular passage, it's not really approaching it from that standpoint. What it's approaching it is your fear is a test of whether you have perfected yourself in love, whether you fully believe that you are full of the love of God, that you're reflecting that love of God and love of brother and sister. And so on the judgment day, you can approach that day without fear. And that's a legitimate understanding, but I think fear has an impact every day on how well, not only is the lack of fear a sign that we have perfected ourselves in love, a growing fear inside us, or a lasting fear inside us, also prevents us from perfecting ourselves in love. Now, the author gets very, very blunt in the 20th verse when he says, if anyone says, I love God and hates a brother or sister, he is a liar. Now, that's pretty powerful for language. He's not wrong. He's not mistaken. He's a liar. The thing that he says is blatantly and untrue. And his reason is that, if you, and it kind of points back to a passage that sort of dropped in the middle of the last set of verses where he says that we have not seen God. Here that sort of comes to fruition as what argument the author was building toward, that if we can't love a brother and sister who we have seen, then how can we love God who we haven't seen? Now you might say, hey, I've seen a lot of people, and some people just aren't lovable. The problem with that argument, if you lay it against everything that's said in these Bible passages, love is not something that is conditional. You don't love because someone is lovable. You love because that is the way you were created. Remember, love is an affection that we have. Love is a sense in which our lives are intertwined with one another. Our fortunes and are connected in a way that we can't separate ourselves. We can't separate ourselves in hate and other things without not only demeaning that relationship, but demeaning ourselves, and in the end, then demeaning our relationship with God. So love isn't conditional. This biblical love that the author talks about throughout this book isn't about whether anybody deserves it. It's about you were created in the Spirit of God. You are created as one of God's children, born of that Spirit, as is everyone around you. So in one spirit, you sever yourself when you sever yourself from one of those that are created around you, you sever yourself from that whole spirit and thus sever yourself from God. So it's a more powerful thing than just the sort of sense of affection that we often put forward with it. Thanks for listening.